Subnautica Below Zero represents a dramatic shift in design from the first game. Where Subnautica emphasized player-driven gameplay and discovery, Below Zero moves towards a more structured and guided experience. The push for accessibility, in many ways, makes it the more polished of the two games, but in doing so, it loses the freedom and mystery that made the original a modern classic. This video compares Subnautica to the spin-off Below Zero. I'll be analyzing how game mechanics accommodate the new design goals and how those designs completely change the core experience. Speaking broadly, where the first game encouraged the player to figure things out for themselves, Below Zero is far more direct. I'll go through the many ways in which this design is achieved, but I think the most obvious example is in the very beginning of both games, which we can examine to see the new philosophy in action. Subnautica opens in the first-person player perspective as your character straps into a life pod, ejects from the Aurora, and is knocked out by a loose panel, with the explosion of the Aurora getting shot down, slightly visible through the top hatch. Upon waking, the player is given control and encouraged to put out the fire in the life pod, and then the world is yours to explore. Most players, on a first playthrough anyway, will probably climb up the ladder since it is in the middle of your vision, and players will have already seen through the top of the life pod in the cutscene, so they know that it's there. Once outside, players are treated to a sprawling ocean surface with the enormous wreck of the Aurora as the backdrop in an immediately iconic image. These first moments culminating with this view tie in beautifully to the emotions of the first game, but that deserves its own whole section, so we'll talk about that much later. What you really notice in the jump to Below Zero is how much the opening moments of the first game are reliant on the player to experience them. There's no narrative yet. There isn't even really gameplay. All you have is the open ocean, a crashed ship, a fire extinguisher, and a tiny life pod. There are limited instructions and almost no backstory or characters. Arguably, this is one of the many ways in which the first game is leaning into the Minecraft inspiration, and this sequence is a fitting opening to a game that relies on a player's curiosity and problem solving. Looking at the opening of Below Zero, it's immediately quite different. Again, the game opens in first-person perspective in space, and the player takes control of a small ship. But all this is happening while a person speaks to you via radio, which feeds the player some exposition that sets up a mystery for some kind of research and somebody named Sam. Once crash landed on the planet, the player is treated to a condensed tutorial area on the surface, where they learn about the coldness gauge and how it's affected by standing near the fire or certain plants and tools. As you run through this area, your player character will say to themselves,
"Holy smokes! That did not go as planned. I should find a way into the water and get to the drop pod."
The drop pod indicator will appear on your screen a short distance away in the water. As you traverse the path to the water's edge, you are treated to your first view of the Arctic vista, a view mostly obscured by weather. The change in design goals between games is readily apparent just in the comparison of those two moments. Look at how much more explicit the opening to Below Zero is. Your character is named, has motivations, a voice, friends, a job, and, to some degree, character traits, all established within a few lines of dialogue. This extends to the gameplay as well. The starting area has two paths, but they reconnect very quickly. The relationship between temperature and the water is established early, with the distance between the last heat lamp flower and the water's edge ensuring that a player will have some cold meter to fill up upon hitting the water for the first time. This entire opening functions as both a narrative introduction and tutorial, without as much freedom to miss important information that the first game provided. Below Zero does not want a player to ever feel lost or to have too many choices. This is what I mean by the wording direct. It wouldn't be accurate to call the game linear, but it is more nearly a series of events, puzzles, or challenges, with a limited number of solutions than a true open world. If we zoom out a little bit from these starting zones, Subnautica spawns you in about the middle of the play area, with no true guardrails to keep you in any particular direction. Conversely, Below Zero starts you off in a corner of the map, facing out at the rest of the game. This effectively constrains the player exploration to a limited number of paths. Most of the mandatory content in Below Zero is in one general direction from the starting area, and your life pod even faces that way, funneling each player into a pattern of exploration with limited variance. These choices are not accidents. Unknown Worlds clearly wanted a more predictable gameplay experience, and to that end, they were successful, although accessibility comes at the cost of player agency. a fairly unpopular direction for fans of the original. Let's address how gameplay loop mechanics were changed or omitted. I'm calling this chapter of the video, Comparison is the Thief of Joy, because if you played Below Zero prior to playing Subnautica, there's a good chance you wouldn't notice these changes, or that they wouldn't bother you very much. Although, I have a feeling that that doesn't apply to very much of the player base, especially given Below Zero's relative underperformance. Every player who played both games chronologically will notice, at least after acquiring their sea truck, that movement speed has been nerfed across the board. While many videos have complained about this for being frustrating and time-consuming, there are probably 3 reasons for this. The first reason is so that both underwater aggressive leviathans in the game are faster than you, although this is sort of weak reasoning since the leviathans could just be made to be faster without also slowing down the player. The second possible reason is that the play area in Below Zero is significantly smaller than the original game, and it could be that the devs wanted to prolong the experience to justify its pricing as a standalone. That's a pretty tough claim to examine, but we do know that Below Zero was originally conceived as DLC and scope crept its way into a full release. It's conceivable that dragging out the runtime by slowing down movement speed was an effort to make the game feel bigger, or at least take longer. I sincerely hope that that's not true, and I don't really have any proof of this, but I've seen some reviewers shout it out as a theory, so I'm going to include it. A more charitable version of this reasoning would be that much of the game is spent in cramped caverns with winding vine forests, and the legacy movement speed just didn't feel right in those sections. Although, this wouldn't explain the reduced falling speed in the prawn suit or the nerfed movement speed of an elongated sea truck very well. The third reason is that the textures and fog layer interactions with the LOD distance still aren't fully finished, and slowing the player down allows the game to display objects more steadily to reduce pop-in. You can occasionally detect pop-in just at the edge of the fog layer, and more consistent texture bugs in certain sections with clearer water, like the glacial basin, but overall the issue is far less pervasive than it was in the original game. Denser fog also works fairly well to limit lines of sight and mostly obscure any potential visual bugs from becoming too noticeable, perhaps at the expense of slower movement speed, especially in a pimped-out sea truck. My strongest argument to support the idea that nerfing the movement speed is wallpaper to cover up LOD issues is that the afterburner upgrade for the sea truck only ever brings you up to parity with the Seamoth for a few seconds at a time. There's a teleporter and an aquarium and a bed, but there's nothing in the game to my knowledge that can get you faster than 12.7 meters per second when underwater, which makes me think the game couldn't look this good and accommodate faster movement. But I don't know that for sure. Perhaps this doesn't really feel fair to point out. After all, the devs came up with solutions to problems they couldn't solve with the game engine, and we know that they're getting away from the Unity engine for Subnautica 2. The biggest gameplay result of the reduced movement speed and limited visual distance is that the game feels far more claustrophobic than it does thalassophobic, but more in that on the section about vibes. The sea truck replaces both the Seamoth and the Cyclops. Many have argued that it's the worst of both worlds, with the smallness of the Seamoth combined with the glacial movement speed of the Cyclops. On the other hand, the modular, customizable nature of the sea truck allows a player to traverse with far more agency, so these complaints are probably grounded in that the game is missing popular vehicles, rather than about the addition of one that isn't as well liked. To its credit, the sea truck handles quite well, and compared to anything in the first game, it's very responsive, albeit slower. But the true casualty of the sea truck is not the Cyclops, but the base building elements. I went over these at some length in my other video, so I won't dive as deep here, but the base building in Subnautica is integrated into the primary gameplay loop by being very useful, but also by being the only way to craft certain mandatory upgrades via the moon pool and modification station, which are how the player is allowed to beat the game. Since the moon pool is basically relegated to handling cosmetic vehicle upgrades in Below Zero, only the mod station is still required to progress vehicle upgrades, and so now, it's the only thing that a structure provides you that a sea truck can't. A player can build one little tube room, a mod station with a solar panel, and play the entire rest of the game in the sea truck. The significantly decreased resource requirements of Below Zero means that a player won't have anywhere close to the Herculean storage demands of the first game, and as a result will not be pushed to invest in a base in the same way. This is in no small part due to titanium ingots now requiring half as much titanium. This sea truck acting as a true mobile base is certainly a deliberate choice from Unknown Worlds, and modular vehicles was something they wanted even back in Subnautica 1. But it is strange that so much capability has been added to the base building elements of Below Zero, while simultaneously stripping out all the gameplay justification to engage with them. These features are now pretty much here for people to hang up all the posters and toys they found, but they serve no unique gameplay benefit that I ever discovered, other than somewhere to put your modification station. The prawn suit was wild in Subnautica, and it's even more wild here. It's the fastest way to travel in the game by a fairly substantial margin when you're out of the water. I don't really know what's going on with the acceleration values on this thing, but it's nuts. Look how fast it is compared to everything else in the game. There's also a quirk of the prawn movement being considerably faster when strafing, akin to a Quake Engine FPS game. Apparently you can even use this to circumvent the bridge lowering section on the surface. This movement quirk is well known enough that it is known as courting, and is even documented in the Below Zero wiki. In the interest of fairness, Below Zero doubles down on some of the more nature-loving aspects, such as animal interactions, of which there are far more here. Sea monkeys have a full wiki page of behaviors around stealing your held item. You can refill oxygen from the big donut fish. Mid-sized predators are far more dangerous than before. The squid sharks can grab you if you're out of a vehicle, or EMP your vehicle batteries to zero like the jelly crabs. The colorful seahorses will microdose you if you make eye contact with them, similar to the mesmers from the first game. The cave lobsters will jump at you and pick rocks off the ocean floor that you can break apart for minerals. Some edible fish have far more complicated animations, like the Arctic peepers or the Giza wheels. I won't go through all of these, but there are so many interactions like this, it's clear a lot of work has gone into making this smaller world feel more full of unique life and creatures than the original game. Although, you may also have noticed that a few of these behaviors are just reskins of existing ideas from Subnautica, especially the way every large creature can grab you exactly the same way that the Reaper Leviathans could, but not everyone will care about that sort of thing, so I won't dwell on it. Much of this video, and most videos about Below Zero, are in the context of how it pales in comparison to the original game. But I also have to acknowledge how much work went into trying to bring the diversity and complexity of Subnautica's safe shallows into every underwater biome of Below Zero. The more structured and careful layout of the small play area has the benefit of being more full of interactions, useful upgrades, and resources. There are forgettable areas, to be sure, but no underwater biome in the game feels unfinished the way the lava zones do. Even the crystal caves, while relatively quiet, are among the most visually distinct in either game, and are here to provide a gameplay challenge, not so much a place to spend time farming resources or hanging out with the wildlife. Community disappointment in the repeated gameplay aspects of Below Zero are usually rooted in that it just isn't very different from Subnautica, easily attributed to Below Zero being conceived originally as DLC. In a series that thrives on a sense of discovery and forcing players to confront the unknown, the novelty of Below Zero wears off almost immediately by reusing so many resources and gameplay beats and progression structures. These points are, again, only so noticeable if you've played the first game prior to this one, which I think was most people's experience. There are many examples of Below Zero keeping the player on track, preventing you from ever being lost or without an immediate goal. This is such an obvious departure from the first game, where getting lost in a new biome is such a common experience, it might be argued that it was an intentional core facet of the gameplay. The tech tree, both encouraging and facilitating exploration, while still present in Below Zero, is no longer your primary motivator for finding new resources in the way that it was in the first game. I don't mean this as a point of criticism. It's a design trade-off in favor of more structured gameplay moments at the expense of some player freedom. Below Zero provides new waypoints almost as fast as a player can travel to them, and making your way in an alien world takes more of a back seat in favor of presenting the player with more gameplay-focused challenges. The waypoints leading to structured moments are often designed more like conventional video game levels compared to what we might see in a typical survival crafting game, or indeed really anything in the first Subnautica. These are fairly common in Below Zero, and some are among the strongest content in the game for making the player problem solve or to play in specific ways. Cracks in the ocean floor that are too small for any vehicles will force the player out of a vehicle to dive with the Sea Glide. Long, twisting caves full of valuable resources and blueprints will include oxygen plants that allow a player to push just a little further, maybe even risking drowning in the hopes that something worthwhile will be just around the corner. Moments like these are also found amply on the way to story locations of the game, ensuring that players will encounter them. The huge jellyfish gardens contain story-essential crafting resources. The only entrance to these gardens requires swimming down below them and up their butthole, and trapping the player in an enclosed space without oxygen immediately puts you in a hurry to get your business done. The architect's body parts are all at the end of complicated cave systems that are full of traps and dangerous animals that force the player to move efficiently and to use those natural formations of the caves as cover from hostile creatures. In my other video, I mentioned a surprising lack of Leviathan integration in the first game. Some commenters pointed out that this was probably deliberate, to enshrine the mystery and scariness of those creatures. It's tough to say if this was developer intent or not, and if it was, it is debatably no longer as true for this game. One section of Below Zero stands out to me as both the greatest challenge in either game, and where the more structured gameplay moments reach their height in terms of stakes. To assemble Alan the alien's new body, you have to go down to the bottom of the crystal caves and pass a couple shadow leviathans. This motherfucker can be an Avengers-level threat if you come down here without a dodging strategy. Work was clearly put into this section being a more serious challenge to the player than the endgame areas of Subnautica. The Shadow Leviathan animations are fluid, and it weaves through the crystal formations far more convincingly than the Ghost Leviathans or the Sea Dragons handled their biomes. Its aggro range is quite large as well, and it closes distance very quickly. In terms of making the player constantly worry about it, the Shadow Leviathan is a huge step up from anything in the original game, or even really anything else in Below Zero, since you are required to be near them at least once. The Shadow Leviathans are serving effectively the same purpose as the Sea Dragons from the first game. They guard the endgame building, they're planned encounters, and they do a lot of damage. The big ol' shrimps roaming around in the open water areas are more similar to the Reapers in terms of their function and placement, although nothing in Below Zero truly replicates a player's first Reaper encounter. There's one other planned Leviathan encounter that most players will see. This is on the surface, but that gets its own entire section of the video later on. Speaking of creature aggression, I noticed that aggro behavior now resets after around 10 seconds or so, and that Leviathans won't chase you for as long as they would in the first game. I'm not totally sure if this is or isn't how it worked in the original, but it was kind of hard to tell since you could outrun everything. In Below Zero, Leviathans are all faster than your vehicles, so the player is forced to rely primarily on dodging through small gaps or finding places to hide until a pursuing creature loses interest. I've seen some discussion that players didn't find this playstyle as engaging as what they had access to in the first game, but it was a choice from Unknown Worlds to emphasize these creatures as threats to be avoided and to make them seem more intimidating. Driving home this point, the stasis rifle was completely removed for Below Zero, and repair tool speed was heavily nerfed, forcing players to be more evasive and less aggressive, while taking longer to recover vehicle damage. Design focus on structured gameplay comes at the occasional expense of exploration. I don't mean this to say that there isn't exploration, or nothing for the player to uncover for themselves in Below Zero, just that any open-ended problems are less frequent than the more explicit objectives. There's a pretty straightforward way to break that down. The majority of places that a player must visit to complete the story are given to them as waypoints, which, upon finding them, generates another waypoint, which generates another waypoint in a trail of breadcrumbs to the end of the game. It is the way that a player arrives in those places, or more accurately, how a player gets down to that depth, which is reliant on player exploration. The difference between Subnautica and Below Zero in this regard is how information is communicated to the player about what to do next. In the original, there were obviously waypoints fed to the player from the radio, which tempt the player to explore the world, expanding their access to resources and upgrades. The only one of these that is a main story moment is the Sunbeam, and even that can be missed. The middle and end game is totally up to you by reading through scans, data entries, and context clues. In Below Zero, the waypoints are story objectives, and the means to get to those places is up to you. In the interest of fairness, there are mandatory things to find in Below Zero that are only hinted at, that still require the player to do a little digging, like the Fabricator body shop. Alan tells the player that this endgame facility is at some depth, but you are required to come down through the Marinara Trench at least once to scan a body part, It's also the only place in the whole game that goes this deep that doesn't also have a clear ending to the cave like the orange flower area. So it isn't rocket surgery to figure this out, and this is in keeping with not wanting the player to get too lost. A better example might be the blueprints to the parallel processing unit that are spread across the wreckage of the Mercury 2. These sections are very similar to the wreckage exploration of the first game, but are far more layered and dynamic, with the addition of oxygen plants in larger structures, with more complicated rooms that have better textures and lighting. If there are hints as to where the Mercury pieces are, I did not notice them. I discovered these places simply cruising around in my sea truck. Although maybe that's not a great example, since the Mercury sections and the parallel processing unit are not in the main story progression path. That point brings me to a split design approach for Below Zero, because while the mandatory narrative progression in the game is delivered to the player very explicitly, there is another path mostly reliant on a player's curiosity and where we have to talk about the stories. There are two stories in both Subnautica games. There's a main story that is told more overtly, revolving around the player's actions, and it culminates with the player leaving the planet. And then there's the side story, which fleshes out the lore and is mostly communicated through data entries or environmental storytelling. In Subnautica, the side content is about the Degassi survivors, and their tale takes place a decade prior to the events of the game. The data entries and voice logs give some context to the experienced events of the game, and some light explanations about the bacteria, but all you ever see of these people are their decrepit habitats. In Below Zero, we get a story of a player character's sister, Sam, whose death some weeks or months prior acts as motivation for us going to 4546B. We also get the story of Alan the alien, the entity that failed to contain the plot bacteria and caused the outbreak, which destroyed most of the life on the planet some 1,000 years ago. So if you've never played Below Zero, you might be a little surprised to find out which one of these is the main attraction, told to the player, which ends with you leaving the planet, and which is backstory or side content, almost entirely communicated through PDA voice logs and a player's own drive to uncover a mystery. Not to dance around it, the Sam narrative can be completely ignored, and a player might stand in front of Alan at the end of the game, with Robin, happy as a clam to leave 4546B behind without giving her dead sister a second thought.
Do you still wish to leave with me? Beyond this teleporter, there is no turning back.
Are you kidding? I can't pass up a chance to see where Architect's coming from. Besides, I don't have another ride.
I do not...
I won't comment much on either of these narratives in terms of how they hold up as pieces of fiction or storytelling. This video is about gameplay, so I'll focus on how the narratives are communicated to the player. Most of both narratives, the characters, the narrative beats, and the stakes, are communicated almost entirely through dialogue and occasional environmental storytelling. In Sam's storyline, this is achieved in voice journals and communications between Sam and Robin, and the environments that Sam worked on the surface of the planet. The main narrative about Alan the alien is achieved mostly in dialogue between it and Robin. It is inside your mind, and is also a kind of sidekick or exposition buddy, like Mimir from God of War. The Alan narrative, and how it brings a player around the map, is a noticeable departure from both narratives of the first game, where the player was almost never given direct instructions. In Below Zero, that figure-it-out design of the first game has been heavily streamlined. I talked about this a little in the beginning of the video, but the new focus on accessibility has so many examples that I couldn't possibly name them all. So once the player has Alan in their brain, there is a total of 4 different voices feeding you waypoints and hints, ensuring that the pace of discovering new places and objects never slows down. The player character will speak to herself to note that you should do certain things. Alan will tell you where important story moments are and populate your HUD with indicators. The PDA will offer clues and hints and instructions. Marguerite will even chip in occasionally to tell the player where to go, although she does like to keep things a little more vague. The game almost constantly fills your ear with lore tidbits and instructions and waypoints and areas of interest and key locations, and even small talk with Alan, which is frequent enough that Alan might interrupt Alan to tell you something important. In a video focused on gameplay, I really don't want to dwell on this sort of thing, but all of the voice acting and all of the dialogue, especially between Alan and Robin, or the slice-of-life melodrama voice logs that you find on the Mercury, are performed and written in a way that I think they're supposed to read as cute and charming, but your mileage may vary. All of this dialogue is part of the new design. to not let the player wander off track for too long, and it extends from the story locations into even basic gameplay functions. The PDA will tell you to build a vehicle, and give you survival tips, and instruct you on the usage of tools and structures. Even the endgame scavenger hunt of assembling Alan's new body, which is the below zero version of the Neptune rocket build, is smoothed out considerably by giving the player the recipe incrementally as the game goes, probably to alleviate you having to build it all at once at the end of the game. Giving the player this task very early also helps ground the game with a tangible goal that you can chip away at slowly, preventing late game stagnation. It doesn't have quite the emotional impact of the rocket ship for me, but feelings on this might differ depending on how invested you personally are in the Alan and Robin relationship. There are some waypoints given to the player to explore in Sam's storyline, which incorporates Marguerite Maida from the Degassi storyline of the first game, but the majority of the overt help provided to the player is in service of Alan's story and surviving the gameplay loops. The irony of including a voiced protagonist and side characters is that the entire Sam mystery could be solved if Robin would ask Marguerite a simple question. None of this is necessarily good or bad, although it is quite different from how the gameplay loops were communicated to the player in the first game, and some of the pushback that Below Zero received from the fanbase is due to how the game over-communicates with the player. A less charitable phrasing might be to say that the game takes hold of your hand in the introduction and never really lets go, in the main story anyway. There's a couple ways we can think about this in terms of design intent. A somewhat financially motivated take would be to say that since Subnautica did gangbusters, which it did, Unknown Worlds anticipated many new players for the spin-off and wanted the game to feel more approachable and accessible, which it certainly does. An authorial intent perspective might say that this was always the intended experience for both games, and the developers just didn't ever get around to implementing more directed narrative elements in the first one, the way that they did for Below Zero. The truth is probably a mix of both, but personally, I think that the developers wanted to preserve the more exploratory and player-driven elements of the first game's narrative, but to still present more deliberate and guided gameplay moments that players would be sure to see. If that's an accurate assessment, then I would say they were mostly successful, and to their credit, Below Zero feels a lot less like underwater Minecraft, and more like its own unique blend of underwater adventure game with crafting mechanics, for better or for worse. It is strange, however, that Sam's story, your ostensible reason for being on the planet, is the part of the game that is optional. And nearly all of Sam's story is experienced on the frozen surface sections of Below Zero, which makes those sections optional by extension. There's even an entire narrative and sub-narrative about Sam, the plot bacteria, and corporate greed that isn't meaningfully integrated into the main narrative or gameplay at all. Sam's story is set up to be a kind of murder mystery, with the introduction of the game and her voicemails heavily implying foul play in her fate. But it ends on this confusing, anticlimactic note, with the big reveal not being corporate assassination or some kind of big conspiracy, but that Sam really did get herself killed in a stupid and preventable way due to her own negligence and paranoia, just like the evil corporation said she did. It's pretty well documented that the lead writer on Below Zero left the project in 2019 while the game was still in development, and that what seems like fairly large chunks of the story had to be rewritten. According to Unknown Worlds blog posts, they were having, quote, trouble defining our characters' motivations early and building key relationships, unquote. A midstream course correction may have led to certain aspects of Sam's narrative shipping unfinished, for which there's fairly strong precedent in this series already. The story of the first game only kicks in pretty late in a playthrough, and the developers are not keeping it a secret that the story was the final addition to the first game. The way the narratives of Below Zero are communicated and incorporated into gameplay appear more central to the game's development than the first, but this is often achieved at the expense of a main story unwilling to let the player discover anything for themselves, and a side story that doesn't seem fully finished. The inclusion of the large surface regions of the Arctic on the planet is one of the more controversial aspects of Below Zero, and a somewhat odd inclusion in a game whose central hook is about being underwater. It seems as though the surface sections are pretty widely considered not to be players' favorite moments of the game, and from what I can see, there are obvious reasons for this. Firstly, despite obvious similarities in mechanical function, managing your temperature doesn't really have the same impact as managing your oxygen. Secondly, the surface can be ignored completely except for one bit at the very end where you leave the planet with Alan, and it is almost completely divorced from the mandatory gameplay and narrative of Below Zero, which can give the impression that those areas are somewhat tacked on or incomplete. There's also a blog post from 2020 that expresses regret that the surface sections feel too disconnected from the rest of the game, and that the solution was putting more time into developing the Glacial Bay biome. Although the most obvious reason why the surface is less popular with fans is probably that the land traversal and physics have not evolved much between games. It's still kind of a mess up here. The ice crust of the planet is given its own version of exploration-based progression with the addition of a temperature gauge. Although, comparing that to a thermometer is a little misleading, since it doesn't actually tell you the temperature. What it really is a third health bar that trades out with your oxygen, steadily decreasing when you are above the surface. This coldness gauge means that a player is only free from a constantly ticking clock inside of structures both above and below the water. This is possibly the most noticeable intersection of game logic and gameplay in the series, even more than the lack of a map from the first game. The coldness gauge is to give the player another upgrade path to meter their exploration of the surface, which functions perfectly well, but, well, this just isn't quite how freezing to death works, is it? Compared to the way the game handles drowning, it feels very gamified. Look, I don't care about realism in my video games, and it's absurd to expect a game that is supposed to be fun to feel remotely like the grueling misery of being in a real survival situation, and Subnautica isn't trying to do that. I'm bringing this up because it immediately jumps out to me as being strange that the icy water warms you up instantly, water that is cold enough to sustain glaciers. In some places, the in-game thermometer clocks the water as being 1 degree Celsius, but it doesn't really matter. This is a gameplay feature, first and foremost. In a more visceral sense, drowning doesn't suffer from the same immersion breakage, since drowning works almost exactly like it's presented in the game, with your vision closing and fading as you black out. There's also a common phobia associated with drowning that nearly all humans with developed survival instincts have to work to overcome. But I don't think this is true in the same way for being really cold, and being on the surface of Below Zero does not inspire quite the same feelings of hesitation to wander from safety. At least it doesn't for me. Drowning underwater also has the benefit of being immediately mechanically readable. No tutorial is required to know that the surface is where breathable air will be. The coldness mechanic is stretching game logic pretty far to present as a gameplay feature similar to your oxygen running out, but the relatively high visibility and numerous common and mostly made-up ways to restore coldness make the surface feel less oppressive and scary and more just inconvenient. I mentioned that the main reason players probably didn't care for their time spent on the surface of Sector Zero could be attributed to the general technical state of it. The walking and running on the surface is significantly disrupted by any objects on the ground that have any collision. The Snow Fox vehicle provides similar convenience to your waterborne vehicles by giving you infinite coldness, but it also handles like a shopping cart in an icy parking lot. The Shai-Hulud Iceworm Leviathan is here. Some people seem to really like it despite its unpredictable hitbox, but some feel it's also too intrusive and spoils the scary quality of the Leviathans due to overexposure. There was the odd choice to make the prawn suit give you infinite coldness as well, despite the surface being woefully unprepared for the player to take it up there. You often take fall damage exiting the prawn on dry land, as though your character jumps out of the top before it can crouch down. There are invisible walls everywhere to keep the prawn from escaping the play area, and it seems as though this could be effectively solved by taking away the prawn's infinite coldness, or just by nerfing its jump height, or maybe both. Perhaps this is leaning into the player freedom by letting them use the prawn suit in areas not built with it in mind, but it was a risky trade-off that exposes the less polished physics of the surface. More than all of this technical shit though, the frozen areas just don't have that much to do or see. These aren't varied and diverse landscapes with a bunch of unique interactions and natural splendor to experience compared to what you can find underwater. There are a few behaviors you can observe with a couple animals, but the main draw here is to learn the weird, tragic fate of the player character's sister. One thing I noted in my video on the first game was the total absence of weather or waves. Below Zero still doesn't have any waves, but the weather is an almost constant presence. Blizzards obscure your vision, rainstorms can be seen from under the water's surface, lightning storms rage in the distance, aurora borealis shines on clear nights, and the lighting goes crazy during sunrise and sunset. Aesthetically, the water and lighting are even more impressive than in the first game. But diminished lines of sight on the surface of the water, the coldness bar, and almost no distinct geography will drive the players underwater for the majority of the time. Nothing in Below Zero replaces the aurora as an above-water landmark, which is sorely missed, but more on that in a bit. The surface of Below Zero is almost like its own game, separated from the gameplay and events of the underwater game. There's a unique vehicle, a separate upgrade path, different flora and fauna, and a unique leviathan, but the upgrade paths on the surface, and the upgrade paths in the water, are almost entirely self-contained. There's nothing unique on the surface that aids your ability to explore the water, or to progress the main story. And on top of the SAM narrative being completely optional to beating the game, it makes the entire surface lose a lot of its potential gameplay value. I have left this less tangible conversation for last, because, while it's incredibly subjective in many ways, it is also the piece of the original Subnautica experience that I feel is most clearly missing from Below Zero. This chapter is about the vibes of Subnautica and how they were forgotten. While the narrative of Subnautica contains themes of environmentalism and coexistence, the moment-to-moment gameplay only occasionally feels that way. Subnautica excels at cultivating feelings of curiosity and isolation. I said earlier that in Below Zero, a sense of claustrophobia supplants the thalassophobia of the first game. That feeling was achieved with an abundance of open spaces underwater, steep drops into nothing, and dark water with no lights or features beneath you. A consequence of the developers wanting Below Zero to have more structured gameplay challenges is that areas can't be so large that players might miss the scary leviathan, or the grabby plants on the floor, or the sea monkey nests with the important blueprints in them. The fog limits visibility so much that you won't be able to see the hulking wreck of the Mercury until you're basically on top of it. This isn't inherently inferior, and as I said before, there were probably good reasons for the denser fog in Below Zero, but it also removes the ability for you to see something in the middle distance and set out to explore it, or to deliberately avoid it. Nothing can visually captivate the player from distance since you can't see far enough in the water to find anything without having already stumbled into it. The claustrophobic sections of the game work well for crafting gameplay challenges, but it isn't quite the same feeling of morbid curiosity inspired by being in open water. There are some moments in Below Zero that do still capture those feelings, but those are few and far between. The majority of a playthrough will be spent traveling, quite slowly, between waypoints at the end of cramped, claustrophobic caves, fed to you by one of the 4 voices in a player's ear. I want to shout out that the void edges in Below Zero now slope down for a while before falling away, becoming more and more sparse until dropping into nothingness, giving me feelings of initial curiosity and then sudden realization that I've gone too far as the light fades away at the edge of the world. Or the inactive volcano which demands to be explored, and the big ol' shrimp circling above it, backlit by the surface as you swim back up, is a fantastic organic moment. Rare as they are, these moments of unplanned discovery harken back to the wonder of a first playthrough of the original game. The visual language of a game can be used to inspire emotion, and also to direct gameplay. There's no better example of opposites in this regard than the opening vistas of both Subnautica and Below Zero. I spoke about these moments in terms of mechanical function at the beginning, but consider these images in terms of the emotions they inspire. The image presented to the player from the top of the life pod is such a masterstroke of visual design and scale that the developers basically built the entire first game around it. It communicates incredible size with this colossal smoking ship dominating the skyline. visceral fear of the open water, and the immediate sense of being lost with the expansive ocean stretching around you in every direction. These opening moments of a game are not to just make the player do things, but it can make the player feel things as well. It's why the first taste of freedom in open world games often starts with a beautiful vista like this, teasing the player with its potential for exploration. Below Zero forgets this. The Below Zero opening image is one obscured by snow to make you go underwater. It works, it achieves mechanical gameplay function, but that's all it does. And finally, a feeling of isolation is achieved in Subnautica gradually. At first you crash land, and you're alone and you work to survive. And then your radio will chime in with the voices of crewmates and life pods with people that survived the crash. Some of these transmissions are urgent, requesting your help. Some are from higher-ranking crew members that need to be rescued, or friendly voices hoping to rendezvous. But all of these life pods are empty when you get there. There are journals from previous survivors and their abandoned habitats with self-contained stories that end in tragedy. A new player might be tricked into thinking that they might be able to meet up with some of these survivors if they could just get to the life pods fast enough, or to catch up with the Degassi crew if they could only track them down. It's probably around the time your rescue gets shot out of the sky and the radio goes silent afterwards that a player realizes how alone they are in this game. The mystery of 4546B and the architects is totally removed because Robin knows all about them when you arrive. The loneliness of being stranded on an alien world is gone with the addition of multiple companions. The awe at the scale of being a tiny thing in a large space is obscured by fog and weather and no distinct visible features to ground the player's sense of direction. The voices and hints and cheery small talk and colorful characters that you experience in Below Zero makes me think that the haunting isolation of the first game was an accident. More of a technical limitation around adding character animations, or a budgetary constraint around hiring more voice actors than an explicit choice to give the game a certain feeling. In some gameplay functions, Below Zero may be the cleaner game, but it ends up being less mysterious, less lonely, and less curious than the first. Below Zero always had a steep climb to justify its existence as a standalone title. In many ways, it's effectively the same game. The same gameplay loops and mostly the same resources. It's the same planet with similar threats and the same animations. Story and progression are still metered by access to upgrades and oxygen. That core of the original Subnautica remains basically unchanged, and is even greatly improved in some areas with more carefully constructed challenges. But it would seem that Unknown Worlds wanted to preserve the player-driven aspects of the first game while prioritizing more structured gameplay, and never found a way to make these designs sing together. The surface of Below Zero, its progression path and narrative, are the half of the game that relies quite heavily on player curiosity, while the main story and its progression path relentlessly holds the player's hand. At best, it's a little unfortunate that the aspects of Below Zero that most carefully follow the figure-it-out, player-driven designs of the first game are also the parts that are unfinished, janky, and skippable. Crafting the world around guiding the player creates more predictable player outcomes with tighter gameplay loops, but abandons the isolation and mystery so beloved from the original game. Thank you for watching this video, and shout out to those of you who suggested I play Below Zero after watching the other video. Your encouragement means a lot. If you felt I glossed over much of the primary gameplay loop functions of Below Zero, consider checking out the video I did on the first game, which goes into more detail. I didn't want to retread that ground here since so much of it is the same. I will pin a comment after I upload this where I will annotate corrections or points that deserve clarity, or anything that commenters point out that I might have missed. If you want to have a dialogue about the game or chat about the sequel, I'm here for it, and as always, feedback is welcome. Goodbye.